Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Strategic blunder or a policy of endless possibilities? Take your pick. However, there's no denying Washington and its coalition of the reluctant are incapable of stopping the spread of the Islamic State. How many boots on the ground will it take to change that? To CrossTalk the Islamic State, I'm joined by my guest, Sami Ramadani in London. He is a contributor on Iraq and the Middle East for The Guardian, as well as a senior lecturer in sociology. In New York, we have Benjamin Reynolds. He is an American writer and a foreign policy analyst. And in Washington, we cross to Ray Locker. He is the Washington Enterprise editor for USA Today. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Sami in London, if I can go to you. In my mind, this is a strategic blunder and an endless opportunity for the powers that be to rearrange the Middle East. They've been fighting terrorist groups in that region for over the entire century, the 21st century, and accomplished nothing. Why do they think they can achieve something now?
I think if we look at their strategy as being to end all these terrorist organizations, then it seems like a futile, endless exercise. But I look at it a bit differently in terms of reading, especially U.S. strategy, U.S. and its various allies. U.S. strategy is anchored on dominating the Middle East, dominating its natural resources, and in addition, supporting Israel. So you have this, if you like, strategic goal. Everything else has to serve these strategic goals. And in terms of terrorism, terrorism has come to the Middle East, especially to Iraq and Syria and Libya, after the invasion of Iraq. In the context of Afghanistan, obviously they supported bin Laden, they supported the Taliban, and the roots of the terrorism of the Middle East go back to Afghanistan. But within the context of Iraq and Syria, the invasion of Iraq opened the door, US-led invasion, opened the door for these terrorist organizations. Remember, these terrorist organizations, their main target has been, when they became extremely active in Iraq from 2004-5 onwards, has been the Shia of Iraq, the Christians of Iraq. The United States did not see them as a threat to its occupation of Iraq. On the contrary, US generals seemed to be happy to see them grow to create sectarian conflict in the country. Within the context of Syria, things became even more open, where armaments, funds flew to the armed groups in Syria, including the so-called ISIS of today.
But what you're saying, if I go to Ben in New York here, is that no lessons have been learned whatsoever. Is that the only policy the West seems to have is just more violence and organized chaos, I would say.
I would say, unfortunately, it really doesn't appear that any lessons were learned after the invasion of Iraq, or much less after the invasion of Afghanistan. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Syria now, the United States essentially has given itself an open-ended mandate for a conflict against ISIS, but also for waging a proxy war against the Assad regime by arming these so-called moderate rebel forces who are going to appear from nowhere, hopefully. I'm not really sure what the long-term strategy is.
We might find these moderates somewhere. Maybe they're hiding out from us here. I'm not sure. I've been hearing about them for over a year now, and they still haven't found the moderates here. Ray, it's very interesting here is that we have an administration that has a Nobel Prize winner at the top of it, and it's bombed 7 predominantly Muslim countries in his time in office, Mr. Barack Obama. I mean, again, for me, it's always been about the learning curve. How much do they learn? It seems nothing. And he even says this problem with ISIS will be solved in the next administration. He won't even be around.
Well, I mean, these problems never get solved. I'm going to agree with some of what Sami and Ben have said and disagree with some of it. I don't think the United States wants to dominate the Middle East. I think the United States, at least from the government officials I talk to and the polls I read, the United States really doesn't want to have anything to do with the Middle East. We keep getting dragged back in there for various reasons. Some self-inflicted wounds. Obviously, the war in Iraq, there were no weapons of mass destruction, no real reason to do it other than they thought that they could do it. Their stated reasons didn't hold up. And that has caused problems since then. I mean, obviously created a lot of the terrorist problems in Iraq. You had al-Qaeda in Iraq that sprouted up because of that. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi because of that, who caused a whole range of problems, not just for the United States and the occupation, but for the Sunnis living there as well. And they wanted him gone as much as we did. A lot of lessons that have not been learned. The United States would prefer to not be there if they had their choice. I don't think that, based on what I've picked up from the White House and other members of Congress, that we want to be there and we want to be fighting a war in Iraq again. The president certainly doesn't want to, and there are considerable pressures to do that. And I don't think anybody would argue that the Islamic State, whatever acronym you want to use for it, is not a bad actor in the region.
Okay, well, let's talk about bad acting. Sammy, I could see you were disagreeing with Ray there. But, I mean, ISIS came about because of bad policy coming out primarily of Washington, out of the White House.
Well, of course, and I do stress my point that domination of the Middle East is important. How can anybody say the United States is not interested in the Middle East when 55% of world reserves of oil are in the Middle East, when 40 to 45% of world gas reserves are in the Middle East, when Israel is in the Middle East, when the Middle East is a collection of very strategically placed countries, Iran, Turkey, and so Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and so on. I mean, this is not really serious proposition. What I stress is that these terrorist organizations do not pose, and I quote Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States, who only about 10 days ago or so declared at Harvard University that ISIS poses no threat to the United States, not to its way of life, not to its security. So what is it that is frightening the United States to declare such emergencies and start bombing raids? I think they are building a new military base in Iraqi Kurdistan near Erbil. That is well known. Duhok, another city in Iraqi Kurdistan, is witnessing the evolution of a military base. The United States is training a so-called, I stress so-called Sunni army. Some of its personnel and former Ba'athist officers are also based in Erbil. There is a lot of detail here which suggests to me that the United States is utilizing the pretext of the savagery of ISIS to push through certain strategic policies. But it faces problems.
Okay.
Turkey and Qatar are linked.
Let's talk about the... Let me go back to, let me go to Ben here in New York. I mean, the proposition of using ISIS as some kind of proxy threat. I mean, the media wants everyone to be really afraid of them, and that's not to mean that they're not a nasty group of people, but they are the worstest, the baddest, the meanest, et cetera, et cetera. They're being funded by the Saudis, but that doesn't get much coverage in the U.S. But Ben, what about Assad, and then the other agenda, Iran?
Well, honestly, if you look at what's going on in Syria and what's been going on in Syria over the past 3 years, the real story there has been about the link between the Syrian government and Iran and about attempting to diminish Iranian influence in the region. That's why so much money has come from Turkey and the Gulf, trying to destabilize the regime and, if possible, remove it. That's largely why the United States has funded a series of covert programs attempting to arm, to some extent, rebels in fighting in Syria. It's not so much about the humanitarian crisis that ISIS poses. I mean, if you look, as long as ISIS was contained within the borders of Syria, it really wasn't a problem for the United States. And it wasn't necessarily a problem for the United States when ISIS entered Anbar province in Iraq, but only when ISIS started to approach some key strategic areas like the outskirts of Baghdad or Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan did we actually choose to intervene. I think it is much more a strategic calculation, although I personally find it to be a dubious proposition that ISIS actually poses a threat to vital strategic U.S. interests in the Middle East, if it has any there.
What do you think about that, Ray? Can you react to that? Because again, it seems to me that ISIS is a lot of hype, and it has a lot of pickup trucks. Go ahead.
I just don't know how anybody could see any of the videos, not just of the beheadings of the journalists and the hostages, but the mass executions of people by members of ISIS, and think that they're this benign group that can be left alone to do whatever it wants in the region. I mean, we talked earlier about Afghanistan, essentially a failed state run by the Taliban, hosted bin Laden. From there, he launched the 9/11 attacks. Now, it doesn't take a great imagination to see what happens if ISIS controls a large swath of Iraq, maybe parts of Kurdistan, maybe even Baghdad, taps into all that oil revenue that it could get, and who knows what it supports. And what's happened in the United States is no politician can afford to take the risks that this is a benign group. We're going to let them do their own thing and worry about what happens later. You have to react. I mean, that's what happens when you have a democracy like this, and we're like 3 weeks away from elections, and chances are Republicans could pick up the Senate. They are more vocal about this than the Democrats are. So there's obviously an imperative on the part of the United States to do something. I'm not going to say that I think it's the right thing to do. I don't know what the right thing to do is. And, talk about what Sammy has mentioned. We got 100 years of history in this region trying to manipulate various parts of Iraq, Syria. No one's got it right. I don't know if anybody's going to get it right this time, but it seems like there's an imminent threat that people need to deal with.
Okay, gentlemen, on that note, okay, well, go. Sammy, go ahead, jump in real quick, Ben. We got 20 seconds. Go ahead.
Ray, I don't think the issue is necessarily that ISIS doesn't pose a problem in the Middle East. It's that the conditions that allowed for ISIS to emerge were actually created by the last series of American interventions in the region. And I think it's imperative for the United States to avoid these kinds of
Okay, gentlemen, on that point, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Islamic State. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd go back to Sammy in London. Ben brought up a really interesting point as we were going to the break here, is that we can always talk about what must be done, what should be done, blah, blah, blah. We always do that in media, but very few people like to talk about origins, and that's exactly what Ben mentioned here. Why don't we ever talk about how we get ourselves into these situations in the first place? Go ahead, Sammy.
Yes, and this is really important, because if we understand how we got here, we might begin to have a solution. And the way we got here is wars and interventions. Look at what happened in Libya. They destroyed the state. Gaddafi was a dictator, yes? But bombing Libya, its infrastructure, its state institutions, has opened it into all manner of terrorist organizations, hundreds of them, in fact, exporting arms and men to Egypt and Syria and so on. Look at what happened to Iraq. Saddam's dictatorship, a brutal dictator. But what did the United States do? Destroy the Iraqi state, its infrastructure, its social institutions. That opened the door for the growth of terrorism. Syria, they have half succeeded in dismantling a lot of the social structures. Syria was a secular society. And look who they armed. The so-called moderates are also very sectarian. There is no such thing as a moderate force in Syria. Qatar alone spent $3 billion within 2 years, 2011 to 13, according to the Financial Times in London. $3 billion on arming and funding some of these organizations. So you have a situation where the United States and its allies, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, are knee-deep in backing these sectarian takfiri. The word takfiri is important here. It means, you regard everybody else who doesn't belong to your very narrow Wahhabi sect. Wahhabi sect is the sect of the Saudi and Qatari royal families. If you don't belong to that sect, then you are a kafir. You are
okay.
a
Let's stay with this.
Who could be killed.
Let's stay with this. Ben, it's very interesting, is because I said in my introduction, the coalition of the reluctant, because there is a lot of reluctance. We have a lot of PR out there, but a lot of people in the region are not so keen on going into battle with ISIS. But ISIS really wants the Americans there, and this is and the Americans are are taking the bait because everybody in the Middle East wants Washington to carry the water. They'll pay for it. The American people will pay for it. And maybe they can avoid boots on the ground. It's probably inevitable that they will end up being that way. And we start the cycle all over again. Go back to 2003.
Well, I'm not so sure that ISIS in particular wants the United States to intervene. I think that was actually the strategy of al-Qaeda going back to 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. But I think the sad reality is that the current American intervention can't actually, and this is something that's been widely acknowledged by the Pentagon, by various officials in the White House, that the current intervention can't really stop ISIS in the way that for the sort of goals that we've set out. You can't really degrade and destroy this organization that's operating largely in cities simply by conducting airstrikes on targets in the open. So again, as you say, there's a temptation. I mean, we already have people who we call advisors, essentially special forces operating in Iraq, possibly Syria. There's a temptation to increase our commitment on the ground, which is one of the reasons we've been looking to arm these, again, so-called moderates, is because you actually need boots on the ground to push people out of these contested areas. The only problem there is that we're either stuck arming people who are going to end up probably fighting alongside al-Qaeda, or American soldiers are going to once again end up in Iraq, which is certainly not something that anybody wants.
You know, Ray, maybe try something different for a change. I know it's politically incorrect to talk about it, but maybe Washington should just make peace with Iran, stop trying to overthrow Assad. And these are two countries that can actually add value to create a security environment in the region, but they keep being shut out of the region in this process. Maybe try something new for a change. Go ahead, Ray.
Well, that is an option, and people talk about it. You know, we are doing the nuclear talks with Iran. They seem to be going fairly well. At least the two nations are talking when they hadn't been talking before. They've talked in the past about things having to do with Iraq and the sectarian violence there. So maybe that expands. I'm not going to venture a personal opinion on Syria. I know that there are many people previously, before the fighting started in 2011, who thought that Assad was somebody who was holding that country together, just like Saddam Hussein was in Iraq. Now, we can certainly disagree with the methods by which he did that, but that country was not a haven for terrorism before 2003. Same with Syria. And as Sammy mentioned, same with Libya. When you break apart a country like that, things spill out that you don't anticipate. And I will agree with both, Sammy and Ben, that when that happens, you're going to have problems that you have to deal with. And the problem, though, is then you're faced with a crisis, and you can either try to enact a long-term strategy in the midst of an imminent crisis like this one, or deal with the crisis. Too often, we end up forced to deal with the various crises that erupt.
Okay, well, but Sammy, I mean,
Can I inject,
go ahead,
can
jump
I inject
in.
another point here, Peter?
Please do.
Yeah, one thing I think we need to also observe is that I really do not think that the United States is interested in having a peaceful, secure environment in the Middle East. You can call this, a far-fetched theory, but my own understanding of the U.S. industrial military complex is that this ginormous, multifaceted sets of institutions in the United States do thrive on tension and war, whether it's their advanced technologies or boots on the ground, as they say. The armaments industry is massive, creating tension. There are hundreds of U.S. bases and facilities across the world, and they still want more, surrounding even Russia. 60% of U.S. naval forces will go to the South China Sea. They've surrounded Iran with bases. Look at what they've done in Iraq, Syria, Libya. To suggest that to start rather from the premise that the United States is interested in a peaceful, secure environment, I think misses the point. The United States does not mind tension, does not mind insecurity in the area, does not mind the flare-ups and wars, because it sells arms. billions upon billions of dollars every year sold of arms to its allies in the region, let alone paying to the paying U.S. taxpayers money on these wars to the military-industrial complex.
Let me go to Ben here. Let me go to Ben here. That's a good point there, because Ben, in this conflict, particularly with ISIS, everybody's got the same equipment. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Okay, everyone has the same equipment fighting this battle here. It all comes from the same country, the United States. You want to react to that, because I mean it's
really
really
interesting how that happens.
Well, I think we all pretty much know how it happened, okay? You arming these people, training these people, and then they decided to change sides, okay? That's how it happened, okay? Ben, let me ask you a question here. I mean, the perception on the ground, I mean, you know, you have ISIS that they don't recognize these post-World War I borders. They made it very clear about the big PR event about it. But I think the West is also ignoring these borders as well. And this is this sense in the region of continued Western imperialism and colonialism, and it sells really well. And let's say the truth here, it's a hard truth, but not everyone that ISIS controls, you know, not everyone there hates them. Everyone, in some cases, they welcome these outsiders coming in because they didn't like how they were being ruled earlier, particularly in Western Iraq. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, I would be pretty skeptical about saying that there's any sort of widespread support, even in the areas that ISIS controls.
I didn't say. Okay, Ben. I didn't say why. I didn't say widespread. I said support.
They are a useful tool, though.
Okay, go ahead. Keep going.
No, they were a useful tool. If you think about some of these ex-Ba'athist elements in Western Iraq, ISIS certainly presented an opportunity to sort of gain more autonomy, potentially break away from what was Maliki-dominated Baghdad. I think, sorry, the first part of your question was?
No, I mean the perceptions on the ground, how people see still another intervention. It just perpetuates this interpretation of Western imperialism and colonialism, because again, it's the West determining borders, who's going to rule, who's not going to rule. From the ground, looking up, that's what it seems.
Well, even if there were no intervention in Iraq and Syria, the United States would still be maintaining a large number of military bases in the Middle East. It would still be funding the militaries of Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia in part. It would still be probably the most extensive arms dealer in the Middle East. The United States has a presence there whether or not it chooses to intervene in any particular conflict. So yeah, I think there is a little bit of basis to saying that the United States has sort of continued this sort of colonial or imperial mentality, albeit for basically increasingly less relevant reasons.
Okay, Ray, do you want to react to that? Because you think of the United States is indispensable; it has to be there. There's a lot of arguments to say that this is what fuels the violence itself. You know, being on the ground,
I think
bombing.
the United States should be there.
Okay, Ray, go ahead.
Well, the United States should be there, whether it's with diplomats, businessmen, and maybe less so the military. You know, it's a global economy. The United States needs to have people everywhere, just like China has businessmen and diplomats everywhere, just like the Russians have people and diplomats everywhere. The extent of the military commitment, I think most Americans, if you ask them, they say they don't want to be in the Middle East. The government, other interests, have a different feeling. They do think we need to be there. You know, we don't know what it's like to have a peaceful Middle East to decide whether the United States likes it or not, because we haven't had one in 100 years. Sometimes it's been the United States' doing, sometimes Great Britain's, sometimes the Soviet Union's, sometimes the people who live there themselves who can't seem to solve their own problems without violence. So, you know, to lay it at the feet of the United States all the time, I think is misleading. Not to say that this nation has not, you know, done its share of meddling.
All righty. All right. On that note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests in London, New York, and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.